In this story, we learn how one quiet night in London changed the life of private detective Edward Hargrave. No high-profile crimes, no screams or chases, just fog, old streets, and an anonymous letter. He didn't disappear where you're looking. This simple phrase marks the beginning of a case with no obvious answers. Where to look is unclear. Who to look for is even more mysterious. But in a city where every shadow hides something, even the smallest disappearance can lead to an unexpected truth. And as London slowly falls asleep, Hargrave takes the first step into a story that will prove to be far deeper than it seems at first glance. London never truly slept. It only changed its rhythm. By day, the city was loud and restless, carriages hammering over cobblestones, voices overlapping into a continuous roar, the air thick with the particular urgency of a place that believed itself to be the center of the world and conducted itself accordingly. But at night, something shifted. The sounds softened, the movements slowed, and over the streets the fog settled with the patience of something that had been doing this for centuries, wrapping the city in grey wool, muffling its edges, making familiar things briefly strange. Edward Hargrave preferred this hour. He stood at the embankment, one hand resting on his cane, out of habit more than necessity, a prop he had kept long after the injury that originally required it had healed. The Thames moved below him, barely visible through the fog, its surface catching the scattered light of the gas lamps in long, distorted reflections. Sometimes the river seemed not to flow at all, but simply to breathe, slowly, steadily, indifferent to the city built along its banks. Hargrave observed. Nothing in particular. Everything in general. He had understood long ago that the world communicates in details rather than declarations. The slightly too rapid footstep of a man who wants to appear unhurried. The door closed with just a fraction, too much care. The pause before an answer that lasts one beat longer than the question warrants. Most people move through these signals without registering them, the way they move through air, unaware that it carries information, that it has weight. Tonight, the city felt unusually quiet. Too quiet in the particular way that Hargrave had learned to notice. Not the comfortable quiet of late hours when nothing is happening, but the held-breath quiet of a moment just before something does. He drew one finger along the back of his glove. An old habit, a way of grounding himself in the physical when the intuitive became insistent. Everything was as it should be. Cold air, damp stone beneath his feet, the distant percussion of hooves on a street somewhere behind him. And yet the sensation persisted. Small, unlocatable, but stubborn. That something had already happened, or was about to. Hargrave did not hurry away from it. In his profession, hurrying was almost always the wrong response. Mysteries rarely reward impatience. They reward attention, and attention requires stillness. Finally, he turned and made his way up from the river, toward the narrow street, where scattered lights illuminated the facades of old buildings standing shoulder to shoulder, like people at a gathering where nobody is quite sure why they've been invited. His office was on the second floor of one of these, unremarkable from outside, which was entirely the point. The key turned in the lock with a quiet click that was always satisfying, the sound of a small certainty in an uncertain world. Inside, warmth and the smell of tea and old paper, familiar as a handshake, reliable as the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, which had marked the passage of time in this room for as long as Hargreave could remember, and which he had never once wound himself, an arrangement whose logic he had never examined. Everything was in its place. The writing desk, its surface clear, the papers arranged precisely as he had left them, the chair by the window positioned at the angle that allowed a view of both the street below and the door. Hargreave removed his coat, hung it on the hook behind the door, and crossed toward the desk, and stopped on the surface, amid the familiar order he maintained, with the consistency of a man who understood that a disordered workspace produces disordered thinking, lay an envelope. It had no business being there. He was certain of this, with the particular certainty that comes not from checking, but from knowing, the certainty of a man who has arranged his environment with sufficient precision that any deviation is immediately apparent, the way a musician hears a wrong note without having to count the right ones. When he had left, the desk had been empty. He was sure of it. He did not approach immediately. First, observation. Always observation first. He studied it from where he stood, measuring the small facts before touching them. The envelope was undamaged at the corners, not crumpled, not bent, which meant it had been placed recently by hands that were careful, or at least deliberate. No visible layer of dust had settled on it, confirming the recency. The paper showed no moisture marks despite the fog outside, which suggested the person who delivered it had not traveled far through the night air, or had kept it protected, or had been inside, waiting, before Hargreave returned. That last possibility was the one he noted most carefully. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Silence, but not empty silence, the kind that has texture, that suggests recent occupancy rather than long absence, the kind that a room settles into after someone has just left it. He approached the desk and picked up the envelope, turned it over. Nothing on either side, no name, no seal, no distinguishing mark. The paper was unremarkable. Neither the heavy cream stock of wealthy correspondence, nor the rough pulp of something hastily obtained. Someone had made a deliberate choice about this paper, which meant the paper itself was part of the message. He set it back down. He was not ready to open it yet. This was not hesitation. It was method. Hargreave crossed to the small stove in the corner, filled the kettle from the pitcher, and lit the burner. While the water heated, he turned up the oil lamp on the desk until the room was properly illuminated. Then he sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the street below, where the fog had thickened until the far side was barely visible, the gas lamps reduced to smears of amber in the grey. He closed his eyes. Not to rest. He was not tired. To think in the particular way that requires the suspension of looking, that allows the mind to work on what it has already gathered without the constant interruption of new input. He had found, over years of practice, that the interval between encountering a thing and acting on it was often where the most important observations occurred, when the mind, freed from immediate perception, could turn its attention to what it had already seen and begin to find the patterns within it. The envelope. No identifying marks. Placed on a desk that should have been inaccessible. Paper chosen with care for its ordinariness. And a room that held the quality of recent presence like water holds warmth, slowly, then all at once dispersing. The envelope was not a threat. He was fairly certain of that. A threat announces itself differently. There is aggression in its presentation, an intention to unsettle that manifests in details. This was something else, quieter, more considered, an invitation. The kettle announced itself. He opened his eyes, rose, prepared his tea with the unhurried precision he brought to everything, and returned to the desk. He opened the envelope with a letter knife. A single clean motion. Inside, one sheet of paper. He extracted it and set it on the desk surface, smoothing it flat with one finger before reading. The message was brief. A single line, written in a hand that was neither hurried nor performed. The handwriting of someone who wrote with purpose, but without affectation. He disappeared somewhere other than where you are looking. Hargreave read it once, then again, then a third time, not because the words were unclear, but because clarity is not the same as understanding, and he had learned not to confuse them. He set the letter down, picked up his tea, thought. Several things followed from those 11 words, if you were willing to follow them. First, he, a specific person, not a generalization, not a philosophical reference. Someone whose disappearance was already a fact, already known to the writer, and, this was the interesting part, assumed to be known to Hargreave as well. The writer took for granted that Hargreave would know who he was. But Hargreave did not know. He had received no case in recent days. No one had come to him with the story of a missing person. No letter, no visit, no oblique inquiry through an intermediary. Which meant one of two things. Either the writer was mistaken about Hargreave's involvement, confused, or misdirected, or operating on information that was wrong. Or Hargreave was already involved in something without knowing it. He considered both possibilities with equal seriousness, as he considered everything. The second he found was the more interesting. He set down his cup and stood. His footsteps on the old floorboards were quiet but present as he moved through the room, the kind of movement that looks like pacing but isn't. Each step was considered, each pause deliberate. He was walking through his own space, the way he walked through crime scenes, letting the room tell him what it knew. He stopped at the bookshelf. The books stood in their usual order, arranged by subject, then by size within each subject, then by a further principle that was entirely his own, and that he had never articulated to anyone. The dust on the shelf lay in its expected thin layer, even and undisturbed. Almost. His gaze stopped at one place. Between two volumes, a natural history and a treatise on cartography, there was a gap. Not large, not careless. Exactly the width of a book that had been removed by someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had not knocked the neighboring volumes out of alignment, who had not disturbed the dust on either side more than necessary. Someone who had not wanted to be noticed, but had left, nonetheless, the trace that careful removal always leaves. Hargreaves studied the gap for a moment, without touching anything. Then he reached out and ran one finger along the shelf, feeling the line where the dust had been subtly displaced. The gap was real. A book was missing. Not a significant one, by any conventional measure. Not a rare edition. Not a reference he consulted regularly. He had to think for a moment before he could identify which volume it was. A directory. Old, some years out of date. The kind of book that lists addresses and occupations and institutional affiliations. The kind of book that is useful not for what it contains now, but for what it records about a particular moment in the past. He straightened slowly, and for the first time that evening, something moved in his expression. Not alarm, not excitement, something quieter and more considered than either. The look of a man who has just understood the shape of something he hadn't known existed 5 minutes ago. He returned to the desk. Read the letter once more. He disappeared somewhere other than where you are looking. The line meant something different now. Not a riddle posed to intrigue him. Not a taunt. Something closer to a coordinate. A correction to a map of an investigation he had not yet begun, delivered by someone who assumed it was already underway. Someone who knew which book to take. Someone who understood that the book's absence would be noticed, and that noticing it would tell Hargreave something he needed to know. He did not reach for his coat, did not move toward the door, did not do any of the things that a less disciplined mind might do upon receiving a message that seemed to demand immediate action. Instead, he sat back down, refilled his cup, and allowed himself to think. In his experience, there were two kinds of mysteries. The first kind had already happened and simply needed to be reconstructed. A matter of assembling the pieces, of following threads back to their origin. The second kind was still in motion, still unfolding. The kind where moving too quickly was itself a mistake, where patience was not passivity, but strategy. This, he sensed, was the second kind. And in the second kind, the most important thing was not to move first. Outside, the fog pressed against the window glass, reducing the street to suggestions. The city breathed on in its slow nocturnal rhythm. The clock on the mantelpiece counted off the seconds with its unchanging patience, and in the warm, tea-scented stillness of the room, in the careful quiet of a mind that had learned to wait for the world to reveal itself rather than demanding revelation, a story was beginning. Small, so far. A letter. A gap on a shelf. 11 words and their implications. But Hargreave had seen enough beginnings to know that the size of the opening tells you very little about the size of what follows. He settled into his chair, set his cup within reach, and gave the silence his complete attention. Morning came to London slowly, as though the city itself was reluctant to commit to another day. First, the light changed, the fog thinning from grey to something almost translucent, the darkness softening at its edges, without quite becoming brightness. Then the sounds arrived, one by one. Distant footsteps on wet stone, the complaint of a shutter being pushed open. The first voices of people who had decided, apparently, that the day was worth beginning. The city woke the way old things wake, gradually, with resistance, carrying the weight of the night into the morning without fully setting it down. Hargreave had not slept. He had remained in the chair by the window through the small hours, largely motionless, his tea cooling unnoticed on the table beside him. His gaze was not directed at the street, or at the room, or at anything visible. He was looking at the problem. Inside it, the way you look inside a mechanism when you're trying to understand not just what it does, but how. The letter lay on the desk where he had left it. He disappeared somewhere other than where you are looking. In the night's long quiet, the sentence had changed its character. It had arrived feeling like a riddle, something designed to unsettle, to produce the particular discomfort of a question without a referent. But somewhere in the hours between midnight and the first grey light, it had become something else. Not a riddle, a direction. He rose when the light touched the window pane, not dramatically, not with the sudden decision of a man who has resolved something, but with the gradual movement of someone completing a thought that has been running for hours. He crossed to the desk, smoothed the letter flat with one finger, and read it again. "If it isn't a person," he said quietly. He didn't finish the thought. He rarely did when thinking aloud. Speaking was for conclusions, and he wasn't there yet. He turned to the bookshelf. The gap was still there. Of course it was. Gaps don't fill themselves, and the night had produced no further visitors, or at least none that had announced themselves. He studied the space again, running a finger along the shelf beside it, checking the neighboring volumes for any disturbance he might have missed the previous evening. Nothing, only the one absence. He stood very still and attempted to reconstruct the book from memory. Not its title. Titles were labels, and labels were less reliable than sensation. He reached instead for the physical impression of the thing. the weight of it in his hand, the color of the spine, the particular quality of its pages. How often he had opened it, and why. The image assembled itself in pieces, the way images do when you stop trying to force them. Dark green binding, corners worn to the cloth underneath. A history, not a rare one, not a reference he consulted for professional purposes, but one he had read for his own reasons, and in whose margins he had made notes in his own hand over a period of years. Not the kind of book a thief would take, not the kind anyone would take, unless they knew what was in the margins. Hargreave opened his eyes. "Not random," he said. He didn't sound troubled. He sounded, if anything, more settled than he had been the previous evening. The way a puzzle becomes less unsettling once you understand that it is a puzzle, and not simply chaos. Someone had entered his office, had taken nothing of conventional value, had left no evidence of their presence except one envelope, carefully placed, and one absence, carefully made. Both deliberate, both chosen with knowledge of the room and its contents. This was not a burglary. It was a conversation. He checked the window methodically, latched from inside, undisturbed. The door lock showed no marks, nothing forced, nothing broken, which meant entry by key or entry by invitation. Neither possibility was as troubling as it might have seemed to someone less accustomed to the ways in which the boundaries of private space could be quietly negotiated by people who knew what they were doing. He returned to the desk and opened the lower drawer, the one that held old case notes, names connected to names, threads he had pulled and followed, and sometimes let go. He turned pages without urgency, not looking for anything specific, but allowing the mind to browse, to notice adjacencies, to feel for resonances between old information and the new situation. He closed the notebook after a few minutes. "No," he said quietly. "This is new." He stood, crossed to the small mirror near the door, straightened his collar, and put on his coat. The movements were unhurried, the movements of a man performing a familiar sequence that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with order. He was not sure where he was going, but remaining still had stopped being useful, and motion, even undirected motion, sometimes loosened things that stillness kept fixed. The street received him with cool air, and the smell of wet stone and coal smoke. The fog had thinned, but not cleared. It hung at mid-height now, above the heads of the people beginning to appear, diffusing the morning light into something even and flat that cast no shadows. A baker was pulling back the shutters of his shop. A woman with a laundry basket moved quickly along the opposite pavement. Two men at a corner were engaged in an argument that had the quality of one that had been ongoing for some time and showed no signs of resolution. Hargreave walked without apparent direction, which was not the same as walking without attention. Every face, every posture, every glance that lingered a moment too long or withdrew a moment too quickly. All of it was information, most of it irrelevant, some of it potentially not. Pattern recognition was not a skill he had acquired. It was a habit so deeply established that it operated independently of conscious decision, the way breathing operates. He moved through the city, and the city moved through him. He turned into a narrower street without knowing why, or without knowing the reason consciously, which was different. This part of the city was older and quieter, the buildings pressing closer together, the space between them too narrow for the fog to fully clear. The light here was grey-green, filtered through grime and proximity, the light of a city that had been accumulating itself for centuries. He stopped outside a small shop. The window display was an arrangement of timepieces, pocket watches with their cases open, wall clocks of various sizes, several mechanisms in various states of disassembly, gears and springs and faces laid out on cloth with the precision of a surgical theater, instruments for measuring the one thing that could not be recovered once lost. Time, Hargreave thought, always leaves evidence. He pushed the door open. The bell above it made a small, clear sound. Inside, the smell of oil and old metal, the quiet industry of a space where close work is done. Every surface held tools or objects in some stage of attention. Behind the counter stood a man of 60, or perhaps more, with the compact stillness of someone who has spent decades performing work that required the suppression of unnecessary movement. His hands rested on the counter. His eyes moved to Hargreave with an alertness that did not look like curiosity, and was not quite its opposite. He did not speak first. Hargreave spent a moment looking at the shelves. He was in no hurry. Neither, apparently, was the man behind the counter. "You repair old things," Hargreave said finally. It was not quite a question. "Anything that can be repaired." The answer was given without elaboration. The voice was steady, accustomed to its own pace. "And if the thing isn't broken," Hargreave said, "if it's simply absent." The man's eyes narrowed very slightly, not with suspicion, with interest. "Then you don't repair it. You look for it. And if it was removed deliberately?" A brief silence, the kind that is not empty. "Then it isn't a thing," the man said. "It's a message." Hargreave looked at him with renewed attention. The answer had come too readily for a man who hadn't been thinking about this. You don't arrive at that formulation in the moment. You arrive at it because you've already arrived at it, because the idea has already passed through your mind and left a groove. "Do you receive such messages often?" Hargreave asked. "No. But sometimes they're delivered here." The words settled in the room like objects placed on a surface, carefully, with intention, without explanation of what they meant or why they had been put there. Hargreave let a moment pass before continuing. "Yesterday evening," he said. "Did anyone come in?" The man picked up a small watch from the counter and began to wind it. A deliberate movement, unhurried, the movement of someone who has decided to take a moment before answering, and is comfortable with that decision. "People come in," he said at last. "The question is who you mean." Hargreave did not press. He had what he needed. Not a fact, not a name, but something more valuable at this stage. Confirmation that this was not a dead end, that the thread existed, even if its color and direction were still unclear. He inclined his head slightly. "Thank you for your time." The man nodded once, already turning his attention back to the watch in his hands. The street outside had brightened. The fog was retreating properly now, pulled back by the growing confidence of the morning light, and the city was becoming itself again, noisier, more populous, more purposeful. Carts were moving, voices were multiplying. The day was establishing its claim. Hargreave walked without hurry, the cool air against his face, his hands quiet at his sides. He thought about the watchmaker's words. "It isn't a thing. It's a message." He thought about the letter, and the gap on the shelf, and the dark green binding with notes in his own hand. He thought about the way the watchmaker had reached for that watch, and what the reaching had meant, and he thought about the letter again, its single line arranging itself once more in his mind. He disappeared somewhere, other than where you are looking. In the night, it had felt like a direction. In the fog of the early morning, it had shifted toward warning. Now, in the clear light of a city that had woken fully and resumed its business, it felt like something else again. An invitation. Not to find something. Not yet. To understand, first, the shape of the space where the thing was not. To map the absence before searching for its cause. The thread was thin. Barely there. But in Hargreave's experience, the thinnest threads were often the ones that led furthest. He turned up his collar against the morning chill and walked on, carrying his questions lightly, in no hurry to arrive anywhere, but entirely certain that arriving was what he was doing. By midday, London had become a different city. The fog had retreated, replaced by the flat, pale light that filtered through the crowded roof lines, without ever quite committing to brightness. The streets had filled. Footsteps, voices, the clatter of wheels on uneven stone. But even in this density, there was something unhurried about it, as though the city had decided long ago that genuine speed was beneath it, and had settled instead for a kind of purposeful drift. Hargreave walked without apparent destination. The watchmaker's shop had given him no facts, no name, no address, nothing that could be written in a notebook, and followed to a conclusion. What it had given him was subtler, and for the moment more useful. The confirmation that the space he was moving through was not empty. That there was a shape to this, even if he couldn't yet see it whole. He turned into a narrower street, one of the city's older ones, where the paving stones had been laid before anyone thought to make them level, and where the buildings pressed close enough that two people passing in opposite directions had to make a small negotiation. Carts rarely came here. The light was grey-green, filtered and indirect. Life in these streets moved differently, slower, more watchful, aware of itself in a way that the broader avenues were not. Hargreave slowed. A door standing slightly open. Not wide, not carelessly, but with the precise degree of openness that suggested intention. A curtain pulled back sharply at a window, then still. A boy who stopped his game when he noticed he was being watched, and looked away with the particular nonchalance of someone who has been told not to look. The city was beginning to answer. He had learned to listen for this, the moment when observation stops being passive and starts being reciprocal, when the thing you're watching becomes in some way aware of being watched. He stopped at a wall where an old notice had been pasted, its paper gone, nearly transparent with age and damp. Most of the text had dissolved into the surface, but a few words remained legible in the center. Missing reward. He ran a finger along the paper's edge. How many such notices had been pasted and dissolved and pasted again on these walls over the years? How many disappearances had moved through this city, generating their moment of urgency, and then being absorbed? The way the city absorbed everything, quietly and without comment. He stepped back, and a thought arrived that reordered the morning's work. The question was not what had disappeared. The question was who had noticed. The street opened into a small courtyard, surrounded by houses with darkened facades, buildings that had the look of things that had been standing long enough to develop opinions about what they'd seen. A bench at the center. An old man on the bench, holding a newspaper. Hargreave stopped at a distance. Not to approach. To observe first, as always. The man had not turned a page in several minutes. His gaze was directed above the paper, into the middle distance, not at anything in the courtyard, not at anything visible. The posture of someone who is not reading, but is using the newspaper as a reason to sit still in a public place without attracting comment. He was waiting. Hargreave walked closer. "You've been reading the same page for some time," he said. The old man lowered the paper without haste, without surprise. "And you have been watching too carefully," he replied. There was no irritation in it, only the measured calm of someone for whom nothing is particularly unexpected anymore. "Sometimes that's necessary," Hargreave said. The man studied him with unhurried attention. "You're looking for something." It was not quite a question, more the statement of a conclusion already reached. "Possibly," Hargreave said. A pause. A cart passed the entrance to the courtyard, its wheels loud on the uneven stone, and then suddenly quiet again. "Then you are looking in the wrong place," the old man said. The words landed with a familiarity that was impossible to ignore. Not the same words as the letter, but the same grammar, the same structure of thought. You are looking, and where you are looking is not where the thing is. Hargreave kept his expression unchanged. Internally, something shifted. Not alarm, not excitement. The feeling of a weight settling more squarely onto its foundation. "Why do you say that?" he asked. The old man folded the newspaper and placed it on the bench beside him, straightening it with the automatic neatness of habit. "Because you are looking at people," he said. "What should I be looking at?" The man raised his eyes to the windows of the surrounding buildings. "What remains when the people leave?" Hargreave followed the direction of the old man's gaze. Windows, curtains, the particular quality of shadow that accumulates in the upper stories of buildings that see little direct light. He scanned them with the methodical patience of long practice, moving from one to the next. And then he saw it. One window on the second floor of the building, directly across the courtyard. Slightly open, not carelessly, not all the way, but with that same precise degree of intentionality he had noticed in the door earlier, just enough to admit air. But the curtain behind it was motionless. Entirely motionless, in a way that curtains near open windows, with the ambient movement of air in a city street, are not, as though something behind it was holding it still. "Is that what you mean?" he said quietly. The old man did not answer. He didn't need to. The front door of the building was closed, but not locked. It yielded to steady pressure without resistance, as though it had been left in exactly this state deliberately. Hargreave entered and stood for a moment in the hallway, listening to the quality of the silence. Not frightening silence, not the silence of a space where something violent had happened, simply empty, the silence of a room recently vacated rather than long abandoned. He climbed to the second floor and found the door to the room, whose window faced the courtyard. It too was unlocked. He stepped inside. The room was furnished. A table, a chair, several books arranged on a small shelf. Nothing overturned, nothing broken. The kind of order that is maintained by someone who cares about order, not obsessively, but as a matter of basic self-respect. A cup had been washed and set upside down to dry. The bed was made with the efficiency of someone who had done it without thinking about it. Whoever had been here had not left in a hurry. They had simply left. Hargreave stood in the center of the room and did not move for a moment. He was not looking for an object. He was trying to feel the shape of the space, what it was accustomed to containing, and what was currently missing from it. The sensation came slowly, then clearly. The same quality he had felt in his own office the previous night, standing before the gap in the bookshelf. A room that had been arranged by someone who thought the way he thought. The same precision, the same care about placement, the same awareness that absence could be made to speak. He turned to the table. A book lay at its center. Dark green binding, worn at the corners. Hargreave did not reach for it immediately. He stood and looked at it, the way you look at a thing when you already know what it is, and need a moment to accept the implications of its being here. Then he picked it up. His own book, his own marginalia in the margins, his handwriting, his shorthand, the notations he had made over years in the way that readers mark books they intend to return to. He would have known it anywhere. He opened the cover. The first page, which he remembered as blank, was no longer blank. Written there, in handwriting, he did not recognize. Uneven but deliberate, the hand of someone writing quickly, but with full intention. "You are already closer." Hargreave closed the book and allowed himself, for the first time since the envelope had appeared on his desk, something very small and very quiet, the beginning of a smile. "So the game continues," he said softly. He looked around the room once more. Nothing disturbed, no sign of urgency or struggle, only the particular stillness of a place that has been prepared and vacated, a stage set and then left for the next person to find. Presence and absence, both arranged with care. He descended and crossed the courtyard. The old man was still on his bench. "Did you find it?" he asked. "Yes." "And what was it?" Hargreave looked at him steadily. "A clue." The man's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but close to one. "Then you are already inside." "Inside what?" The old man unfolded his newspaper again, settling it open at the same page. "The story," he said. Hargreave walked away from the courtyard with the book under his arm. He did not look back. There was no need. He had already taken from that place what it had been left to give him, and returning attention to it would yield nothing further. He thought about the sequence. The letter on the desk, the gap on the shelf, the watchmaker with his careful non-answers, the old man in the courtyard, the unlocked room with its waiting book, each element placed with precision, each one pointing forward without completing the picture. A chain of signposts on a road whose destination remained hidden. Someone was constructing this with patience and skill, not leaving a trail by accident, designing one, testing not just his ability to follow it, but the quality of his following, whether he would rush, whether he would make assumptions, whether he would arrive at each new element, having attended properly to the last. Hargreave found, with mild surprise, that he wasn't troubled by this. He was, if anything, the opposite. He looked down at the book in his hands. "You are already closer." The question that mattered was not who had written it, or how they had obtained the book. or what they expected him to do next. Those questions would answer themselves in time, if he continued to move carefully. The question that mattered was the one the message left deliberately unanswered. Closer to what? He tucked the book more securely under his arm, turned up his collar against the afternoon chill, and walked on into the city, which had, over the course of this day, become something it hadn't been that morning. Not a backdrop, not a setting, a participant. By evening, the city had begun its transformation again. The daytime noise dissolved gradually, giving way to quieter sounds. Footsteps, distant voices, the occasional firm closing of a door. London was returning to its natural state, watchful, reserved, patient in the way of very old things that have learned there is no advantage in rushing. Hargreave did not rush. He made his way back to his office at the unhurried pace of a man whose thinking requires motion. He held the book under one arm. It had ceased to feel like an object some hours ago. It had become a link in a chain being assembled by someone with considerable care and no apparent intention of revealing its full length. He felt no threat in this. He felt attention, which was different and more interesting. The office was as he had left it that morning. The clock marked its steady count. The air was undisturbed. Everything occupied its proper position, with the appearance of having remained there faithfully in his absence. Hargreave closed the door and stood without moving. He understood that appearances of this kind were not the same as facts. He set the book on the desk and did not open it. Instead, he moved through the room slowly, giving his attention not to what he was looking for, but to what was actually there. There is a discipline in this distinction that most people never acquire. The ability to see what is present rather than what you expect to find. The desk, the papers, the shelf, the window, and then the lamp. It stood perhaps 3 centimeters from its usual position, not dramatically displaced, simply shifted with the same precision that had characterized everything else in this sequence, by exactly enough to be noticed by someone paying the kind of attention Hargreave paid, and not noticed by anyone else. He lifted it. A sheet of paper lay underneath. He unfolded it and read. You are looking for a disappearance, but you have not asked the essential question. Why are you certain that anything has disappeared? He read it once, then again, then set it beside the book and sat down. The room felt quieter than it had a moment ago. So, he said quietly, it isn't about what's missing. He closed his eyes. If nothing had disappeared, if the disappearance itself was the fiction, the premise he had been handed, rather than the fact he had discovered, then what was actually happening? He thought about the room where he had found the book. Orderly, undisturbed, nothing missing. The deliberate tidiness of someone who cared about arrangement. exactly like his own office. He had read both spaces as places from which something had been removed. But what if they were places where everything had been retained? Arranged, curated, left precisely as intended? What if the sense of absence he had felt was not evidence of loss, but a manufactured impression? He opened his eyes and looked at the room again, this time differently. Not as a space where something had been taken, as a space where everything remained, but had been quietly adjusted. He crossed to the bookshelf. The books were in order, precisely in order, each spine aligned with the shelf edge, each volume flush against its neighbor. And that was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, wrong in the way that only he would recognize, because he knew his own habits with the accuracy of a man who has lived carefully in a careful space for many years. He did not arrange his books with this degree of precision. There was always a small residual asymmetry, a volume pushed back slightly, another at a fractional angle, the natural variation of a working collection. This was not his arrangement. Someone had handled his books and replaced them more precisely than he ever did, had corrected his natural imprecision into something cleaner, carefully enough that the difference was not immediately visible, only felt. He stepped back. Not a disappearance, he said quietly. He looked at the lamp, at the note, at the book. A substitution. Not something removed. Something changed. And changed in a way designed to make him think first about removal, and only later, if he was paying close enough attention, about alteration. He picked up the book and opened it. His own marginalia ran through the pages as they always had. But between his marks, something new had been added. A pencil line, fine enough to be missed at a casual glance, connecting specific words across multiple pages. Not random words, chosen ones. He followed the line carefully, page by page, and the words it connected formed a sentence. Do not look at what has disappeared. Look at what has become different. Hargreave closed the book. He looked at the 3 items on the desk: the original letter, the note from beneath the lamp, the book, and understood the structure of what he was inside. This was not a case about a missing person or a missing object. This was a case about perception. Someone was testing the quality of his attention, not his ability to find what was gone, but his willingness to notice what had changed, to question the premise he had been handed, rather than simply working within it. Most people who were good at finding lost things were not equally good at noticing altered ones. The mind, told that something is missing, hunts for the gap. It stops seeing what is present, because the present things are not supposed to be the point, unless they are, unless the gap was the misdirection. And the point was what remained. He crossed to the window. The fog was returning, coming in off the river, filling the lower streets. softening the edges of buildings until they looked like suggestions of themselves. The gas lamps became halos. The city became quieter, more intermittent, more like a rumor of itself. Hargreave looked at his reflection in the glass. "You want me to see?" he said quietly. "Not the absence, the difference." He returned to the desk, made a fresh cup of tea, looked at the book, the notes, the too-perfect shelf. "Very well," he said. The clock ticked. The fog pressed against the window. Not searching, not hunting, simply seeing. Night settled over London again, with the quiet inevitability of something that has been doing this for centuries and no longer needs to announce itself. The fog returned as it always did, not arriving so much as simply being present again, as though it had merely stepped back for the day and was now reclaiming its natural position. It moved along the streets without hurry, softening the hard edges of buildings, wrapping itself around the gas lamps until each one became the center of its own small golden world. The city's sounds had contracted to their essential minimum. A distant set of hooves, a door closing somewhere several streets away, the particular silence that follows the last voice of an evening. Hargreave had not lit the secondary lamp. The single flame on the desk gave him exactly what he needed. Enough light to see, not enough to be distracted by seeing too much. The room existed in a careful half-dark, its objects softened to shapes and suggestions, which was, he had found, often the condition most conducive to genuine thought. Sharp light produces sharp focus on individual things. Soft light allows the whole to be held at once. Before him on the desk, 3 items. The book, the first note, the second. He was no longer trying to solve them. He was watching them. This was a distinction that had taken him years to understand and longer to practice. The instinct, when presented with a problem, is to move toward it, to lean in, to apply force, to pursue the solution with directed energy. This instinct is useful for many kinds of problems. For others, it is precisely wrong. Some things reveal themselves only when the pressure of active pursuit is removed. Only when you are willing to wait and receive, rather than advance and take. He had reached that state now. He could feel it. The particular quality of attention that is neither passive nor aggressive, that holds its object without gripping it. The clock measured the room's silence in its unhurried way. Each second dissolved into the next, without accumulation, without urgency. And in this state, balanced between waiting and knowing, between question and answer, something began to shift. He noticed it first as a quality of wrongness rather than a specific observation. Something in the arrangement before him had changed. He looked at the desk without moving, letting his gaze rest on the 3 items without directing it toward any one of them in particular. The notes lay as before. the book occupied the same position. And then, one of the notes was oriented at a slightly different angle than it had been. Not dramatically. A matter of degrees. The kind of change that most people would attribute to their own earlier handling, and not think about further. The kind of change that was invisible unless you had been paying the kind of attention that registered the original position with sufficient precision to notice the deviation from it. Hargreave did not move toward it immediately. He allowed a small, quiet smile. "So you're here," he said softly. The silence did not answer, but it changed quality, became less empty, more inhabited. The distinction is real and perceptible to anyone who has spent enough time in rooms where things happen quietly. He straightened slowly in his chair. "You don't want to speak," he said, still quiet, still unhurried. "So you show instead." A pause, a faint movement of air through the room, not from any window, from no identifiable source. And beneath it, barely audible, a sound like the edge of a fingertip drawn across paper. He looked at the book. It was closed as he had left it. But he was certain, with the certainty of a man who has learned to trust this particular instrument, that it was not in precisely the same state it had been a few minutes before. He reached out and opened it. The pages turned more easily than they should have, as though they had been recently handled, and stopped of their own accord in the middle of the volume, at a page that had been unremarkable when he had last examined it. It was unremarkable no longer. New writing in the same hand he had seen before. Careful, unhurried, completely certain of itself. "You are still looking." Hargreave read it. Read it again. Held it. Then he closed the book. "No," he said quietly. "I am seeing." And in that moment, not dramatically, not with the sudden clarity of revelation, but with the gradual settling of something finding its right position, the room arranged itself differently in his understanding, not physically. The objects remained where they were. The lamp gave the same light. The fog pressed the same way against the window glass. But the frame through which he was looking at all of it had shifted. This case, if case was the right word for what this had been, was not about the book. It was not about the notes, or the missing volume from his shelf, or the room in the courtyard with its unlocked door and its waiting text. It was not about whoever stood behind the sequence of careful arrangements, though that person was real, was present, was even now perhaps somewhere in the same building, or the same street, or the same fog. It was about him, about how he looked at things, about the difference, which was enormous, though it appeared subtle, between searching for what was gone and attending to what remained, between hunting the absence and reading the presence, between moving through the world as a place that owed you answers and receiving it as a place that offered, to those with sufficient patience, something better than answers, understanding. He sat with this for a while. Then he rose and moved through the room. Not searching, not checking, simply moving through his own space with the unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere to be and nothing to prove, and has decided to simply be where he is. He stopped at the bookshelf. The books stood in their too perfect order, the correction someone had made to his own imprecision, the alteration he had noticed hours before. He looked at it now without the framing of violation, without the lens of intrusion. Looked at it simply as a change, and understood something further about the person who had made it. Not a vandal, not someone exercising power over his space, someone demonstrating something, using his own environment to show him what he had not been seeing. The shelf had been corrected not to disturb him, but to create in him the conditions for noticing. The lamp had been moved not to signal presence, but to conceal a message, yes, but also to make him look at the surface of his own desk with fresh attention. Every alteration had been calibrated to serve a specific pedagogical purpose. He was being taught, had been from the beginning. The note on his desk, he disappeared somewhere other than where you are looking. Not information about a case, a redirection of method. The book returned to an unfamiliar room. You are already closer. Not encouragement, confirmation that the approach was working. The note beneath the lamp. Why are you certain that anything has disappeared? Not a riddle. The central lesson, stated directly. The line in pencil connecting words across his own pages. Do not look at what has disappeared. Look at what has become different. And now, tonight, you are still looking. Followed by his own answer, spoken into a room that may or may not have contained a listener, but which felt, in that moment, like the right place to speak it. No, I am seeing. He crossed to the mirror near the door, stood before his own reflection for a moment. What he saw was familiar. His own face, his own posture. The same man who had stood at the embankment 2 nights ago, watching the fog on the river, and feeling that something was about to happen. Outwardly unchanged, but something had shifted in how he occupied himself. Something small and not visible in a mirror. He had entered this sequence of events as a man who applied his considerable abilities to the solving of problems, who moved toward questions with method and precision, and the expectation that method and precision would yield answers. Who was very good at this, and who had never thought seriously about whether being very good at this was the same as seeing clearly. It was not the same thing. Seeing clearly required something that solving did not. The willingness to be wrong about the premise. To hold the given frame loosely enough that a different frame could be offered. To accept that the absence you've been sent to investigate might not be an absence at all, but an instruction in a language you haven't yet learned to read. He had learned to read it, or had begun to. He returned to the desk, gathered the 2 notes and the book and arranged them with care. Not randomly, not in any particular system, but with the attention he now brought to the placement of things, which felt different than it had before, not more effortful, more genuine. He looked at them for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, to whom he couldn't have said precisely, to the person who had designed this, to the process itself, to the city, which had been a participant rather than a setting throughout, perhaps simply to the experience of having been shown something he hadn't known he was missing. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. Those had been charged, expectant, watchful, containing something withheld. This one was complete, the quality of a space in which something has concluded, not because it was interrupted, but because it arrived at its natural end. He extinguished the lamp. The room settled into a soft darkness that was not empty. The ambient light of the fog-reflected city came through the window in a gentle, diffuse glow, enough to see the shapes of things without sharpness, which was, he was beginning to understand, often the right amount. He sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the fog continued its patient occupation of the streets. A figure moved through it somewhere below, unhurried, anonymous, going somewhere or coming from somewhere, carrying a life that was invisible from this height and this distance. A person who did not know they were being seen, and whose not knowing made the seeing a kind of gift, a reminder that the world is always fuller than any individual vantage point can capture. Hargreave watched until the figure was gone. Then he closed his eyes. He did not think about the case. He did not run through the sequence of notes and alterations and arranged absences, extracting further implications. He did not plan what to do next, or construct theories about who had orchestrated this, or decide what it meant for his future practice. He simply sat in a city that breathed around him, in a room that had been the site of a quiet education, in a stillness that was not the absence of meaning, but its completion. The clock continued its work. The fog continued its. The city breathed in the way that very old things breathe, slowly, deeply, without apparent effort, drawing on reserves that have been accumulating for centuries. And Hargreave rested within this, not as a man who has solved a problem and is waiting for the next one, but as a man who has understood something, imperfectly, provisionally, in the way that real understanding always arrives, and is allowing that understanding to settle before asking it to do anything. Some stories, he thought, and it was less a thought than a recognition, don't end with an answer. They end with the disappearance of the need for one. The question had been, what disappeared? The answer, arrived at slowly across 2 days of careful attention, was nothing. Nothing had disappeared. Things had changed, and in changing had shown him how to look at change, how to see it without flinching, without forcing it into the shape of loss, without reaching for the comfort of an explanation before the thing itself had been fully seen. The fog moved. The clock spoke. Somewhere in the city, a door opened and closed. Hargreave sat in the soft dark of his office and did not need anything to be otherwise. This, he understood, was the end of the lesson, and possibly quietly the beginning of something else.